I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, continuing concern over the meaning of the wanton jihadist murders in the city of Paris. And in the Jewish world, questions are being asked about what the attack means for the Jewish people, the state of Israel, and Jews all over the world, and to what extent is anti-Semitism at all a factor in the terrorism and murder perpetrated by ISIS. Well, for some perspective and insight, we have on our JBS phones from Israel a person you know very well here on JBS, the director of ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, Dr. Charles Small. Charles, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you. It's an honor, as always, to be with you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. So, Charles, where were you when you learned of the jihadist attacks in Paris?
I had just arrived in Israel. Last week, ISGAP opened our first seminars at the Sorbonne in Paris. I was in Paris from Sunday to Wednesday, and then Wednesday I traveled to Kiev, where we opened our first program at the university in Kiev. So I was not far from Paris in my memory and in my experience when I heard the horrible news Friday evening in Israel.
Okay. First of all, by the way, Charles, Mazal Tov, the fact that you're opening up an office of ISGAP at the Sorbonne and then in Kiev, and they're very different, but you deserve credit, and again, Yasher Koach for both. It must have been a kick to open up each of those two offices, correct?
It was. We started our program at the Sorbonne 1 year ago, exactly a year ago, and Robert Wistrich, may he rest in peace, was our opening speaker in 2014. And we came back to open our academic year again this past week. So it was an auspicious time to come back to Paris. And
what about Kiev? What was that like?
So it felt like Paris is a very tense city. We felt it very much. It was a difficult 3 days for my colleagues and I in France. We experienced anti-Semitism on the streets and in the academy. It was a rough week. So France and Paris seems to be the bastion or the focal point of contemporary issues. And then going to Kiev, and we traveled to Babi-Yar Thursday afternoon and spent some time in that area of Kiev. And from there, we went to the university to open our program. So it felt like Paris is the contemporary problem and Kiev is the history of what can happen when we don't take these issues and these warning signs very seriously.
Very well said.
It was a hard week.
Very well said. By the way, you said you experienced anti-Semitism both in Paris in general and in the academy. What are you talking about? What did you experience?
So we're shooting a film on issues of anti-Semitism. And I traveled, we toured parts of Paris with Glenn Feder, who's the director of ISGAP France and ISGAP Paris, and Ian Halprin, who's an award-winning filmmaker. He's doing a film with us on anti-Semitism in Europe. And Ian is also a musician, so one of his colleagues, fellow musician, is also from New York and is a lead guitarist for many of the Broadway productions in New York, a very accomplished musician. We were on Rue de Rosier, which was it was the old French quarter of Paris, and we saw two young people wearing Palestinian kaffirs in the center of the Jewish community. So we asked them very politely, why are they wearing a kaffir, and if they support Fatah or Hamas. And they became incensed, very aggressive, and actually physically attacked my friend Ian. So it was, but our friend who's a musician is also a black belt in karate and warned them that he's a black belt, and they went away. But this was in broad daylight, Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock, and they were calling us Zionist fascists and apartheid supporters and colonialists, and Israel's the worst state in the world after the United States. The United States is worse, according to these two young people. So that was we were in Paris at that moment just for a few hours. That was our welcome to the streets of Paris. And then in the seminar that we run, some scholars took exception to the presentation that I gave and my colleague Glenn Feder gave. And we were speaking about how the focus and the demonization on Zionism and on Israel and the demonization of Jewish peoplehood, in a sense, obscures the view of radical political Islam by focusing on the Jews and Israel, that we're missing the main point of how this reactionary social movement is gaining power in the Middle East and even in the suburbs of Paris. And this is the example that I mentioned. And so some people take exception to that type of analysis, and tragically, my colleague Glenn and I were correct in our presentation at the university. And hours after what we were discussing and saying was happening in France as we spoke on Tuesday, tragically and horrifically became very much the reality on Friday evening.
Okay, so Charles, as you look at the tragedy in Paris, what do these events reveal? What do you feel we should learn from them, both as citizens of the West, and then we'll get to the Jewish component? But you've been dealing with a certain kind of hatred, most specifically hatred for Jews and anti-Semitism. But you understand this in a larger sense. And so I'm asking the first question in this larger sense. What do you take away? What are the lessons for you, or what do you learn from what happened in Paris with the murder of more than 125, 130 people, and there are 350 more seriously injured, many of them critically injured? What does it mean to you?
So what it means to me, and this is what my colleagues and I have been arguing for many years now, it's very simple. Radical political Islam is a reactionary social movement. I am not speaking about Islam, and I am not speaking about Muslims. In fact, Muslims are tragically the greatest victim of this reactionary social movement. So if liberals care about Muslims, they have to take this reactionary social movement that is coming out of the Islamic world seriously. So this reactionary social movement, which is diametrically opposed to democratic liberal values like equality under the law, like notions of citizenship, the equality of men and women, the rights of gay people, the rights of religious minorities, the rights of Jewish people to basic notions of self-determination, for example. If we care about these issues, and I'm sure your viewers care about them, then this reactionary social movement needs to be understood. It needs to be named by our leaders. It needs to be understood that this is an ideological reactionary movement that we need to understand and we need to deal with it. And they use anti-Semitism as a core element of their ideology to focus on the Jew while they're trying to destroy democratic institutions and societies in their midst. And the attack on France is just another part of the jihad against democratic principles. And they use anti-Semitism as a diversionary tactic, much like the Nazis did when they were rising to power in Europe. And I think that, and there's a thirst for this in Europe and around the world for leaders to take a strong, unequivocal position, to name it, to understand it, and to combat it ideologically, and I guess by any means necessary. We have to defend citizens of democratic countries, and we have to defend the rights of all people.
Yes. Charles, I want you to develop this point a little bit more, because there is a debate about whether it matters that the President of the United States and the administration refers to what you call a reactionary social movement with any terms that relate to Islam. You've said that that ISIS and the terrorist groups that right now are on the extreme end of the Muslim world they do not represent mainstream Muslim thinking or the vast majority of Muslims. If that is true, then why does it matter whether the President of the United States refers to them as an Islamic jihadist group or extremist, Muslim extremists or Muslim jihadists? Why does it matter whether the term Muslim is applied to the groups that are now engaged in this kind of anti-Western war of extermination? Why does it matter whether the word Muslim is applied? When you say it's important that they be named, do you mean that you want the word Muslim and jihad to somehow be in the designation, or is it unnecessary?
So I'm not advocating the use of the word Muslim. In fact, I would argue against using the word Muslim or Islam. What this is an Islamist reactionary social movement, or some scholars call it Islamism, which is a distinction from Islam. It's the sort of the political, social movement of this reactionary force, which is opposed to democracy and opposed to moderate practices of Islam, of sort of everyday Muslims getting on with their life. So Islamism or Islamist or jihadist needs to be named. It's almost like, you imagine if we conclude that cigarettes cause cancer, how can we educate the public to stop smoking if we're not allowed to use the word cigarette? It's absurd. And we see this movement is organized. It's steeped in philosophical thinking. It started in Egypt about 100 years ago. People like Qutb and al-Banai, as a reaction to British colonialism. There was a philosophical and a religious argument that was made. It has this ideology, which started in Egypt at the turn of the century, has changed, and it affected Wahhabi Islam, it affected Hezbollah, it affected the Shiite Iranian revolutionary regime and their thinking. It's politics or political philosophy fused with a serious religious argument, which has been interpreted, and it has a political mission, it has an ideological mission, it has a military mission. And if we don't name it, then how do we fight it? Mm-hmm. And I think that this game, this Orwellian game that is being played by so-called intellectuals and policymakers, it needs to stop. We have hundreds of thousands of people that have been massacred in Syria. We have more than half of the country has been made into refugees. The refugees are threatening the stability of neighboring countries, and now it's affecting Europe. We have legitimate refugees coming into Europe, and now we see that if these refugees are not vetted properly, terrorists may be coming with them. Mm-hmm. And what are the implications of that? Because if the population of Europe begins to experience or believe that some of these migrants are in fact terrorists, we could begin to see the fabric of democratic countries becoming, frail at the seams. These are very serious issues, and the longer we don't name it, what will it take? What will it take? How many refugees, how many dead people will it take for us to say there's a problem, to name it, to begin to understand it, to discuss it rationally as scholars and thinkers and intellectuals and policymakers, and take a responsible moral position? How long are we supposed to wait before we name it? Mm-hmm. How long?
It's interesting. The administration, the State Department, the President of the United States, in fact, as we're speaking, the President recently gave an address, a press conference, in which he addressed the tragedy in Paris and talked about how one combats ISIS and what his policy is going to be going forward. And the President says that ISIS can only be defeated if the underlying causes driving the ISIS phenomenon is somehow dealt with. That what we must understand even more than what ISIS is doing, is what are the causes that drive the ISIS violence? As you look at it, to what extent do you agree with that framing of the problem? Is it about underlying causes which should be addressed, or is the ISIS phenomenon in and of itself being driven by an ideology that has nothing to do with whether people are, whether there's poverty, inequality, whether there is colonialism? From your perspective, what's driving ISIS? And when you hear a discussion of we need to understand the underlying causes, what's your reaction?
So I did not hear the president's remarks. I knew he was having a press conference, but I was unable to hear it or read about it. But I would say, I've written about it, there are underlying causes for this crisis, and they need to be understood, and I think they need to be addressed. But before I talk about the causes, I think it's imperative to realize that people have agency and movements have agency. And if there's a movement in the name of God or in the name of inequality that goes and advocates the killing of groups of people, the incitement to genocide against Jews, or the killing of innocent people in a pizza parlor or listening to a music concert or having a coffee on the streets of Paris, there is nothing that can morally justify that behavior. And anybody who carries out these horrific acts, there can be no moral justification for that I am aware of. That there's no ethics that I'm aware of that can justify that type of action. Now, having said that, I think that I would argue that there are causes of this, the reasons why this movement is gaining power. And I think that we see societies or states have been failing. They've been failing for all sorts of reasons that go back to colonial times, that go back to the period of structural adjustment advocated by neoliberal economic policies. There was a concerted effort to weaken states so that the free market system could come into societies and bring about more economic development. And I would argue the weakening of modern nation states, particularly in the Middle East, has caused a power vacuum in which radical Islamists have gained power. And it's a complicated process, but I think there's been scholars looking at why there's been this sort of massive dislocation in many societies, and states are failing. Mm-hmm. And I think Lloyd Axworthy, who was a Canadian member of Parliament, saw this happening 20 years ago, and he advocated a tax that on every international financial transaction there'd be a small tax of a few pennies that would go to poor societies and to help educate and feed and give hope to people in countries that were facing abject poverty. So when you take away education subsidies and basic nutrition subsidies, you take away the possibility of a modern nation state and modern development coming to your society, when you have no hope in the future, and somebody comes along with this reactionary social agenda and provides you with religious education and a little bit of social welfare, it becomes attractive. And I think, we see this in Syria, where middle-class people were left to fend for themselves for a long time in the Syrian context, and they became radicalized. And this is it's a human catastrophe.
Okay.
So there are underlying causes, but nothing justifies this, and I'm choosing my words carefully, nothing justifies this barbaric behavior and this barbaric view of Jews, of women, of gay people, of religious minorities. Nothing.
Okay.
And we in the West must stand up for democratic values and principles, and if we lose those values in these discussions by not naming the enemy, by not naming the issues and the problems, and not defending our values, then we're in a very serious situation.
Charles, you have been now in Israel for a few days. What's been the reaction that you've seen in Israel to the Paris murders? And Israel has been dealing with terrorism for decades, and the world hasn't been terribly sympathetic to Jewish suffering or the Jewish anxiety that's caused when you have to live in fear of the kind of attacks we've seen in the streets of Israel from at this recent wave of Palestinian violence and murder. First, how are Israelis relating to the carnage in Paris? And Charles, do you think in any way the world will be more sensitive to Jewish suffering in Israel because of what we now see happening in Paris?
Right. So first of all, from my limited contact with people, I spent the day at Tel Aviv University and a few events and seminars today, and I had a quiet Shabbat and met some colleagues and friends yesterday. So I think the mood that I found is one of deep sadness and horror at the attacks in Paris, and there's a collective acknowledgement that this is what Israelis have been dealing with for a long time. And I think there's quiet resignation that the West just they don't want to deal with the reality of this social movement and the reality of the agenda and the barbarism of these terrorist movements. So I think there's quiet resignation. And there's a famous or a well-known philosopher from France. His name is Daniel Sibony. He's a very important thinker, an intellectual in France. He was born in Morocco and moved to Paris as a refugee in the 50s. And I remember when Ahmadinejad and the Iranian regime were being very outlandish in their anti-Semitism and in their Western rhetoric. And I told them, we were together, and I said, you see, now this is good because now the West will realize how horrible the regime is, the Iranian regime is, not just to the Israelis and the Jews, but to Western and American interests.
Yes.
And he said to me, no, he's a psychiatrist, a professor of psychiatry, and he said, and philosophy, interesting man. And he said, no. He said, basically what happens when people's worldviews begin to crumble, and the reality is not making sense based on their ideological worldview, what usually happens, it takes very brave, open-minded people to say they've made a mistake or to change their views. It takes very open-minded, intelligent people to do that. Most people double down and protect their worldview and actually become more aggressive to people who disagree with them.
Interesting.
And he told me this 8 or 9 years ago, and sadly, I see this too often, and it's sad. And I think we have to, especially in the United States, I think the political discourse between those who are pro-Democrat or pro-Republican has really become a shouting match and name-calling. And I would urge your listeners, we need to discuss ideas. We have to stop calling each other names. You're anti-this or pro-that. We have to discuss the issues open-mindedly. We have to see what's happening. The world is changing quickly, and I think we need to kind of catch up to the changes in the world and find new footing and new ideas and new ways to combat the problem, but also to speak with each other.
Yes.
To be open with each other.
Yes.
To have Shabbat dinners where we're not calling a conservative person names or a liberal person names, but really talk about the ideas, talk about the changing reality, read each other's articles, talk to each other, and argue and debate ideas, but respect each other as individuals.
Yes.
It's very important.
Well said, Charles. You know, Francis said that this attack is an act of war. The Pope says we have begun World War III. Are we in a world war now, Charles?
We're in a very difficult and serious situation. There are a group of people. There's a coherent ideological force with a religion, with a philosophy, with a political agenda and a military agenda, and they have declared war on the Jewish people, and they have declared war on democratic society. And it's significant. It's a real threat. And we have to realize, we have to understand this movement and this ideology, and we have to understand and we have to respect them enough to read their thinkers, to read their theology, to study the mind of our enemy. And whether we're nice to them or mean to them, they may not change. It may not depend on our worldview and our actions the way, that they may not change the way we want if we behave in a certain way. We need to understand them and respect them enough to really hear what they are thinking, praying, and wanting for the future, and understand them. And once we understand this issue, we can start developing effective strategies to deal with it. But it's a very serious, it's a crisis.
Yes.
It's a global crisis, from Nigeria to Iraq, and from the suburbs of Paris to the suburbs of New York City. There are things happening that we need to understand and defend our values. Democracy is not inherited. Democracy needs to be cherished and protected. We need to understand this threat and to do it and to act in a way that alleviates human suffering. And the answer is not carpet bombing and violence, but to think this through in a very serious manner. But it's a serious threat, and it's here.
I appreciate the insight, Charles, and I always am so glad that I have an opportunity to share your thoughts with our viewers. You have a good rest of the time in Israel. Then when you come back to the United States, we'll see each other. And I've got to get you in studio. But I thank you very much for the time. Your insights are always so valuable. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be on your show. And thank you for your time, Mark.
You
All
be
the best
well.
to you and your colleagues.
Thank you. The thoughts of Charles Small, director of ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. As always, my thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, program coordinator, Serge Goldberg, to the associate director of JBS, Dara Golub, and to the producer of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.